as we hear your word this morning. In Jesus' name, everybody said, amen.
Well, amen. It is an exciting day. We are excited for a lot of reasons. Obviously, it's been said, we're outside, which is an incredible thing. We get to celebrate baptisms, which is one of our favorite things here. But I'm excited that we get to open God's Word together and close our series we've been in called The Gospel According to Ruth, as we kind of put a book into this story that I hope for you has been an incredible encouragement and a great reminder of God's goodness and the way even that we see the gospel present in an Old Testament book. And so what I want to do for us this morning is we're going to jump into chapter 4 of Ruth. If you have a Bible, you can go ahead and begin turning there. It's the last chapter in the book of Ruth. And what we're going to do is as you're going there, I want to just kind of walk us through a little bit of where we've been. If you have not been with us every week, I would highly encourage you to go back and listen to this entire series. I think it's an incredible story. And if you've missed a week here or there, then you miss out on the fullness of the story. But let me walk us through. If you're new, maybe this is your first Sunday with us, let me walk us through where we've been as we kind of walk into chapter 4 today. Chapter 1 opens and we learn about a family that is living in the city of Bethlehem in the middle of a famine. The family is, the husband's name is Elimelech, and he is married to a woman named Naomi, and they have 2 sons. And so upon them living in a place where famine, food is gone, no longer have food available, they decide we're going to take our family, we're going to move, and we're going to go and leave and enter into a neighboring country, the country of Moab. And we heard a little bit about how Moab was created last week. So they go into Moab to try to seek food and seek relief in the midst of the famine. And upon doing so, they find food. And they live there for about 10 years. And over the course of those 10 years, the 2 sons that Elimelech and Naomi have, they marry Moabite women. And they marry Moabite women. And then also what we see is that while this is a time of celebration, which is the marriage, we also see a time of great sorrow as we learn that Elimelech, the head of the household, dies along with the 2 sons. And what we find at the end of chapter 1 is we find Naomi with 2 Moabite women as daughter-in-laws. They hear that the famine has lifted, that food is back in Bethlehem. And so they leave, they pack up their bags, and they head back to Bethlehem where they originally were from. And they enter into the city. Naomi and Ruth, the other daughter-in-law, stayed in Moab. And so we find Naomi and Ruth entering back into the city of Bethlehem, and we find them sorrowful. In fact, Naomi says, I am bitter. The Lord has dealt bitterly with me, right? I left this place full, and I have returned empty. And then we enter into chapter 2, where we find that Ruth says, all right, well, we're here. We've got some needs, and so I'm going to go and start looking for food. And she lands in the field of our knight in shining armor named Boaz, and she begins working in his field. She begins gleaning in his fields, which is basically she gains grain where she can provide some kind of life and income. And what we learn at the beginning of chapter 2 is that we have 2 massive needs that Naomi and Ruth have. One of them is that they need food, and the second one is that they need a family. They need somebody who will provide and take care of them. A lot of that is cultural. They need a man in their life, and they don't have that. And so we find those needs. And what we find by the end of chapter 2 is after kind of this introduction to Boaz and the kindness that he has to welcome Ruth into her field, we find that food essentially is covered. That need is met. And potentially family is met as we kind of see the sparks fly between Boaz and Ruth towards the end of chapter 2. And then as we enter into chapter 3, which was last week, we learned a little bit about Naomi, the mother-in-law, a little bit of a mischievous plan to try to get Boaz to take mention, to recognize Ruth, and really for Ruth to put herself out there to say, hey, Boaz, I'm yours, and I'm here, and I want to marry you. And we get this whole plan that gets laid out. But then at the end, we get this heartbreaking news that there's actually somebody that is more suited to be able to marry Ruth before Boaz. And so we kind of, in the midst of this story where we're like, yes, it's all working together, we kind of get this a little bit of a disappointment, which leads us into chapter 4 where we're at today. And so what I want to do today for us, I know we're outside, I know it's a little bit different than being inside, is I want to just challenge us. I want to set the scene and allow us to climb back inside of this story, to try to learn what it is that the men and women here are experiencing, what they're walking through, what it looks like. And as we do so, I think we get a picture ultimately of kind of what's happening here, but then greater than that, right? We get a picture of how the gospel and how we see God's hand upon, and it's really his providence lay out in the lives of these. So if you have a Bible, we're going to be in Ruth chapter 4. We're going to start from verse 1. And the way we're going to do this, we're going to kind of read and we'll stop and we'll read and we'll stop. We'll kind of unpack essentially what's going on. All right, so here's where we get to Ruth chapter 4, starting in verse 1 and 2. It says this: Now Boaz had gone up to the gate, and he had sat down there. And behold, the Redeemer, of whom Boaz had spoken, came by. And so Boaz said, Turn aside, friend, sit down here. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city, and he said, Sit down here. And so they all sat down. All right, so here is ultimately what we have at play. At the end of chapter 3, what we learn is that the way that God had set up these systems was that the nearest relative, the kinsman redeemer, it's a word that's established that we learn, is that there is the way that widows were cared for during this time was essentially they were set up that the next closest male relative would have been called the kinsman redeemer, was set up to be able to then care for people that had lost husbands and also people that were looking to sell land. In fact, what I want to do this morning is very quickly, I want to turn you back to the Old Testament, like further back, the law that was established when God set this up. Because ultimately what God does in Leviticus and Deuteronomy is he sets up for the people that are walking through these difficult situations, he sets up a system for these people to be cared for. So here's what we read. In Leviticus chapter 25, verse 24, it says this: If your brother, this is the dealing of land, right? And let me just, before we read, the acquisition of land during this time was everything. It was your establishment of wealth. It was the way in which you made an income. It was the way in which you provided for your family. Land meant the world. It was everything for the livelihood and for the life and for the ability to sustain income and to have a living. It was everything for people in this time. But what God did is he set up a system that the land that's acquired by a family, it would never leave the family. The land that is owned by one family would always remain inside of that family. And the way it would work is that the closest male relative would have rights to purchase that land. And then if that male relative couldn't, then it would go to the next nearest male relative all the way down. And here's what we read in Leviticus. If your brother becomes poor and sells part of his land, then his nearest redeemer or his nearest male relative shall come and redeem what his brother has sold. And if a man has no one to redeem it and then himself becomes prosperous and finds a sufficient means to redeem it, let him calculate the years since he had sold it and pay back the balance to the man to whom he had sold it, and then to return to him his property, right? So essentially, the nearest male relative is going to purchase the land. If that person gains money, he can go back and buy it back and back pay and all these kind of things. So that's the way it deals with land. And this is everything. So when Boaz is saying refers to the Redeemer, he's talking about, hey, I am a Redeemer. Ruth and Naomi, I am a redeemer, but there's actually a guy that's closer to you in relative relationship in the family line that he actually has the rights. So what happens is Boaz pulls this guy aside. When he says the redeemer, this is one of the things that he's referring to. Now, when it comes to widows, there's another kind of setup. And again, this is another system set up. And here's what we read in Deuteronomy about the system of the wife or the widow being cared for. It says this, Deuteronomy 25, if brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, then the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside of the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go to her, take her as his wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her, and the first son whom she bears shall succeed to the name of the dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. All right? So ultimately what we find is that there is the same way in which land was acquired is the same way that women were to be cared for. If their husband passed away, it's that the nearest male relative would marry them, and would go through and then all of the responsibilities that come from being a husband now fall on him to his now new wife of his former brother. And this is kind of what ultimately happens. So when Boaz speaks to the Redeemer, he calls him aside, knowing that this was the responsibility that this man held, and they begin this conversation. Now, what's interesting is that in this, the language that we read is that Boaz, the way he talks about this guy is he talks about him like he doesn't mention his name. We don't see his name anywhere. He's referred to, essentially, the way it's read is he's referred to as like Mr. So-and-so. That's kind of the way that we would read it. It'd be like this. If you ever walked into a room where you saw somebody enter and you're like, oh man, I know I'm supposed to know that guy's name, but I don't. And you just all of a sudden you begin to panic, right? And here's what it ends up being. You walk up to him and it's like one of those, hey, buddy, right? That's essentially what we have happening here is that Boaz is essentially referring to this guy. He's like, hey there, buddy. pull up a chair and come have a seat and let's have a conversation. And this is how the conversation unfolds. Boaz in Ruth chapter 4, verse 3, he says this, then he said, he being Boaz, said to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought that I would tell you of it and tell you to buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. And if you will redeem it, then redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. And the man, the Redeemer, said, I will redeem it. All right. Now, here is ultimately kind of what we see is that Boaz puts before this man an offer that he cannot refuse. He says, hey, there's a piece of land. It's a great piece of land. It's owned by Naomi. Elimelech has passed away, and you are the next in line to purchase it. And the man said, well, of course I'll buy it, right? This is a perfect opportunity for me. Because again, what do we learn? Land is everything. Land is an opportunity for you to pass it down to a son, an inheritance. It's also another means of income for you to harvest and to plow and to glean that field. It's more money. It's more income. It is more opportunity. And so when Boaz goes and presents this opportunity to this man, he puts before him something that he cannot refuse. Now, if I want you to imagine with us that Ruth being excited and nervous, and Naomi, after Ruth returns at the end of chapter 3, they've gone and propositioned themselves to Boaz. Boaz says, I will go talk to the Redeemer. And there's all this tension essentially is waiting on this moment when Boaz and the Redeemer would have this conversation. And what we see is that as the information is being released to this Redeemer, what does the man say? He says, I will redeem it. And I imagine, right, that in this moment, Ruth and Naomi just sorrow, like just disappointment fills them when they hear that this man is going to redeem the land, which means that Ruth no longer can be married to Boaz. And it means that they will no longer glean in the fields of Boaz, that now their right and responsibility has been fallen onto another redeemer. Now, they've been redeemed, but it's not the way in which they would want to be redeemed, right? And so there's essentially there's this moment of disappointment as he says that, as the Redeemer says, I will redeem this land. It would seem if you were reading this like, Boaz, what are you doing? Why would you offer it this way? Right? But here's the thing that I love about Boaz is that he's so sneaky and sly in the way in which he presents this information. Because what he does is he sets up for the Redeemer. He tells him only one part of the truth, right? He tells him only one part. He says this, hey, Naomi owns some land and you have the opportunity to buy it. And when you buy it, you also buy the responsibility of Naomi will live on the land and you will provide for her as a mother-in-law, not as a wife, but as an older woman. She was outside of childbearing years. So all of this stuff was there and was possible. And so essentially what he's saying is like, this is it. But he leaves out one little thing, which we get to in verse 6. And here's what it says. Or verse 5. Boaz says this. It's almost like he says this, oh, wait, hold on really quick. Now that you redeem it, by the way, one more thing. The day that you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, right? It's this, oh, wait, one little detail. Before you decide to sign on the dotted line, here's one last thing. You have to, not only do you get the land, but you also have to marry Ruth. And in marrying Ruth, you then also the responsibility of giving her a son. And when you give her a son, all the land that you just purchased, it doesn't go to your sons. It goes to the new son that you have with Ruth. And it gets passed down that line. And it's all done in memory of Ruth's former husband. That's the situation, all right? And it's almost in this moment like Ruth, like a Boaz has caught Ruth's eye. And it's like, as he sees her sad because of what has just happened, he's like, he winks at her. He's like, I got you. Watch this. And he lays this information out, right? And in this moment, what we find in the story is that there's this moment of what is going to happen next. Everything hinges on what is going to happen in verse 6. Because in this whole thing, it's set up for us of who's it going to be that's redeemed? Who is it going to be that's going to provide? And then we get to verse 6, where the Redeemer says, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. You take my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it. And we all exhale and we throw our fist in the air because the love story has been complete. And we see that Boaz and Ruth will get to live together forever. in happy harmony, and it's this amazing thing. And then what we find is we see kind of the explanation of some of the customs of the time. And here's what it says, verse 7 and 8. Now, this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal. I imagine it like this. You know, we in life, we you know, in the process of trying to gain things or acquire things or succeed at something, everything comes with like some kind of token of victory, right? Like if you win a championship in football, what do? You run out into the field and you hoist the trophy up above your head. I remember watching, one of my favorite movies is Remember the Titans, and at the end of the movie, there's this really cool moment where the two coaches go out there and they grab the football together and they hoist this football in the air, and it's this moment of victory. And in this moment, what does Boaz do? He takes this sandal, and I just think he hoists it in the air because he's so excited at what has happened, that now he has been given the right to perform the act of being a redeemer, of not only purchasing the land, but then what we see next is that Boaz is going to stand up and he's going to publicly declare all of these incredible things. And here's what we read in verses 9 and 10. And then Boaz said to the elders and to all of the people there, and I want you to imagine this is like, he's at a gate, right? He's at this public square. He's at a place where everybody can lay eyes on him. And he stands up in front of all the people there, all the elders of the city, the leaders of the city, the people that had gathered, and he proclaims these things to the people gathered. He says this, you are my witnesses. You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. Those are their two sons. Also, I have purchased Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon. I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead and his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brother and from the gate of his native place. And you are witnesses this day. All right, so what Boaz does is he proclaims what we read in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy. He says this, hey, what I've done is I am purchasing the land, and not only that, but I am purchasing the right and the opportunity and the responsibility of marrying Ruth, that the name of her former husband will not be blotted out. It will not be forgotten. That the son that will come from our marriage eventually will be the one that will inherit this land, and everybody will remember, right? His name will not be blotted out of Israel. And he does this in a very public way. Now, let me just remind us of a little bit of the history, right, we've looked at with Ruth being a Moabite. She comes from the country of Moab. Last week, we learned how that happened, right, from essentially the incestuous relationship between Lot and his daughters. We learned about that, but this is how Moab was formed. This is how it was created, right? We know that there is tension between Moab and Israel because of the way that essentially Moabite women were scandalous in their behavior towards Israelite men. And yet here is what Boaz does is he stands up, and not does he just say, I take Ruth, he says, I take Ruth the Moabite. It's almost like a sense of pride for him that in this moment he stands up and he declares that, hey, who she is, all that she is, everything about her, I purchase and I buy, and I take her to be my wife that we may have children, and I take the land to be mine as well. It was the moment, the thing almost that symbolized Ruth's thing that might have caused her to be an outcast. Boaz makes it a form and a proclamation that this thing is not only something that I am inheriting, but it's something that I am like joyful almost in the way in which he speaks these things. Verses 11 and 12, it says this, then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman, speaking of Ruth, who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem, and may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman. I just need us to understand like what is being said here, right? The witnesses, the men, the elders, the leaders of the city, what they look at Boaz and they say, hey, we hope that your future wife, that Ruth, that she will be like Rachel and Leah. Now, let me just Here's what Rachel and Leah together, their children, right? 12 boys that essentially become the 12 tribes of Judah, 12 tribes of Israel are named. Like they essentially say that we hope that your house is this fruitful. A Moabite woman married to this man. We hope that your family becomes the family that essentially is going to be built up in the same way that Rachel and Leah have respect and their house was flooded with kids, is in the same way that I hope that your house is filled in the same way. It is a massive proclamation that they say to her. This is not language that we would use for a foreigner. This is language we use of family. And what they see here in this moment with Boaz and with Ruth is what they're saying is we hope that your house would be a blessing. It would be a place where where sons are raised and where the nation, essentially where your house would be fruitful, and that ultimately that your house would be a place that would be a blessing because of the offspring that you will give us. We learn in verse 13 that Ruth and Boaz become husband and wife, and the Lord allows them to conceive. She has a child. She's born. She has a son, and then in verse 14 and 15 it reads like this: and then the women said to Naomi. So they look at the mother-in-law, right? The one that left Israel, that left Bethlehem full, that returns empty, the one that is sorrowful and she's struggling, and she says, change my name. I'm no longer Naomi. I want to be called Mara because the Lord has dealt bitterly with me. These women look at her as she holds her grandbaby and she says this. And then the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer. And may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you, speaking of the child, a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Here's what the women of this town say. They say, hey, Naomi, see the blessing that is before you. The Lord has blessed you by coming and by giving you the opportunity to have for a child to be raised. The needs that you once had, they are being met before you. And I love what they say at the end, right? Because the reason, I would say one of the things that Naomi returns back to Bethlehem sorrowful about is not only has she lost a husband, but she has lost her 2 sons. And what they do to speak to the blessing that Ruth is to Naomi is they say, hey, not only is she an incredible daughter, but she to you is more than what 7 sons are. It is a reminder to Naomi that the Lord is not dealing bitterly with her. He is dealing in a way of providing blessing in her life. That God in the midst, we looked at this last week, right? That sometimes our sorrow and pain is preparation for God doing something else. And essentially what they're saying is, hey, look back. Look at the way that God has taken you in your season of sorrow and blessed your life in this way, because he has placed in your care and in your family this woman who is greater to you than 7 sons. It is an incredible, incredible moment. And this moment, we see, we kind of see the end of the story, right? We tie it up in a bow. It's beautiful. And we kind of say, man, what an incredible moment. Now, I want you to think, like, you ever been in a movie before, and as you go to a movie, you're sitting there and the movie ends, right? And you're like, oh man, that was awesome. And so you're like, I don't even want to leave. But you do, and you get up from the theater and you start rummaging around. And you're like, all right, I dropped my keys through the cup holder. Let me find them. And you're like shining your light. You're like, okay, I got my wallet, I got my phone, I got my keys, pick up some trash. And as you turn to walk out of the theater, you like hear something from the screen, right? And all of a sudden you stop and you're like, whoa, there's more. And you turn around to the screen and you see that there's like one last thing that in the midst of the credits rolling, they want you to see. And this is kind of how I see verses 16 and 17, because this is ultimately like this last little cliffhanger thing that says like, here is one last little nugget that's really, really good. And here is what it says, verse 16 and 17. It says this: Naomi took the child. You can see this playing out. Like she's sitting there holding this child, laid him on her lap, and became his nurse. She became his caretaker. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. And then we get this, here's the picture of what would be to come from this child. They named him Obed, and he was the father of Jesse, who was the father of David. And what we learn in this moment is that the most popular king to ever become king in the nation of Israel essentially was born out of this relationship. that this relationship between Boaz and Ruth established here is going to lead to essentially the greatest and most popular and most famous king in all of Israel being born just a few generations later. Is what we learn. It is this incredible, almost like cliffhanger at the very end of this story to say, hey, guess what? The story's not over, because here's what's coming from it. Obed, and then Jesse, and then David, the one that Israel would put their hopes in, the one that would lead with incredible victory and valor and all these different things. And all the stories we know about David, how he slayed the giant and how he led the people and all these different things he did. This essentially is where that relationship would be established. And oh, by the way, guess who else also comes from the line of David? Jesus, the Messiah, the coming King of the world. It is this, I just think as we look at the end of this story, it is this unbelievable picture of how God uses circumstances to align things in our life and in the life of Ruth and in the life of Boaz to set up for us and for them things that they never in a million years could have imagined. I just love the idea, the thought that as Boaz and Ruth are holding their child, they look back, and especially Ruth, she's looking back at all the things God has done, just cannot believe that God has brought her to this point. And this is ultimately this is what our life is like. This is what God does in our life is that as we walk with God through certain things, that there are seasons that come that are sorrowful and they are painful and they are difficult and they are conflicting, and all these things are a part of our story. But ultimately what God is doing is he is building up and creating for us and in our lives something that we cannot see with our eyes. But as we get down the road and we're able to look back, man, do we see the goodness of God playing out in our life. That it is something so far beyond what we ever possibly could have thought or could have imagined. We have entitled this series, The Gospel According to Ruth. And the reason why we have done so is because what we believe is that packed within this story is the gospel, not the gospel of Ruth and Boaz, the gospel of Jesus. Because ultimately what we learn is this, and this is how the whole story kind of comes together in this gospel moment, is that Ruth, a foreigner, a Moabite woman, she is welcomed into the care and the kindness of Boaz. She is able to, a woman who has circumstances where I don't know what I'm going to eat, I don't know where I'm going to go, I don't know the answers to my life. She's welcomed by Boaz in her field, not only just to glean, but to come and have a meal at his table, and she is welcomed in kindness into his life. And not only that, but as the story goes on, what we find is that Boaz, in this incredible way, he stands up in public and he says, hey, this woman, the Moabite, the foreigner, all the things that you have once declared about her, I declare that I redeem her. I want her to be my wife, and I am providing her with something. And as eager and as willing as Boaz was in this moment to redeem her, how much more willing and eager is our God to redeem us? That he says, hey, you are welcome into my field. You are welcome at my table. I have a place set at my table where you can come and you can eat. And not only that, but then Jesus, as a way of saying, hey, these people matter to me. How eager and willing was he to be elevated and lifted up on a cross in a public way to say, hey, all of these people that I've created, they matter. And I will purchase by my blood. I am purchasing them and buying them for myself. This is the picture of the gospel. And it is a picture that wherever we are today, wherever you have come in, however you have entered into this field out here, into the grove, whatever has brought you here, the reminder is that no circumstance can separate you from the fact that God elevated himself, was lifted up in order to purchase and redeem us by his blood. It is a beautiful, beautiful story. And so what I want to leave us with today are 5 truths that we learn across the story, this entire book, from chapters 1 through 4. Let me just 5 takeaways for us this morning. And I'm going to quickly go through these, all right, as we kind of wrap up. The first one is this, is that God brings his people from death to life. We see chapter 1 opens. What we find is we find death and 3 funerals. That's chapter 1. In Naomi and in Ruth's life, they all experience death and sorrow and 3 funerals. The book ends with marriage and a baby. We see life. We see God taking people who are walking through death and experiencing that to providing them and reminding them of the life that he gives. He gives them marriage and he gives them a baby. The second thing we see is that God brings his people from curse to blessing. right? Even the feeling probably that they say was like, oh, we're cursed. A Moabite woman, we're cursed. All these different things were cursed. And what happens is that by the end of the book, we find that people that once maybe had been declared cursed are walking into a season of blessing. Only the work of God. Only something that he can do. Thirdly, we see that God brings his people from bitterness to happiness. Remember what Naomi said? What did she say? Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, for what the Lord has dealt bitterly with me. That's what we see. In the end, as with the last picture we see of Naomi, she's holding this newfound this picture of blessing. We find her holding this baby that would be for her a redeemer for her own life and for the life of Ruth. We find that she is not in a season of bitterness anymore. She is blessed, as the women, her friends, remind her of. Number 4 is that God brings his people from emptiness to fullness. I left empty. I left full. I've returned empty. That's where we find Naomi. That's where we find Ruth. Where do we find them at the end? Full of life, a family full, a blessing that's been declared by the elders and the people there. We hope that your home is full. That's the blessing. That's the prayer that's been laid over them. So we find people that were once lonely and once empty. They have been filled because of the blessing of God. And lastly is that God brings his people from despair to hope. And this one I think hits harder for us today than maybe any of them. I don't know if you're in a season today where you find yourself in a season of despair, where you're struggling, walking through just the pains of life and the things, and you're like, I have no hope. I despair. I don't know. I'm in this season where I don't feel like I have hope in my life. What I would offer to you is that God brings his people from despair to hope. I have to share this story. I shared this at a Monday Bible study a couple weeks ago, but for years, we went to Cape Town, South Africa with a church that I worked at in Birmingham. And one of the incredible things that happens there is we get to meet people that are living in Cape Town, and essentially the ministry that we worked in there. One of the things that they did, that they focused on, was they would go into these communities and these villages where essentially hope had been robbed, and they did all they could to try to provide hope. And the guy who ran this was a pastor, and he went into these communities and he began to do work, and they did AIDS relief. They do like testing and all these kind of things. And what happened is they walk into this moment and he meets this little girl. And this little girl, through a lot of details I won't share, she had found herself into a season of hopelessness. She was young, and she had fallen pregnant due to some crazy situations. And she ends up going to this clinic that was for young women and children, and she turns herself in, and she begins to meet there. And John Thomas, who's the guy who runs the ministry, he walks into the clinic because he got called there. He said, hey, we have a girl that has come to our clinic, and she has named her baby. And the way she named her baby in the language there was she named the baby No Hope. That was the name. And she said, it's interesting. He was like, I remember him telling the story. He's like, how would you do this? Like, you walk around and when you call for your child, no hope, come here. No hope, it's time for breakfast. No hope, we have to go. And this is essentially what had happened, was because of all these circumstances in her life. Well, through all that, John meets her, has a conversation with her, introduces her to some women, some people in their community and in their network. She begins to go to church and go to some prayer services and ends up giving her life to Jesus. And she goes back to the clinic. And she goes back in and she renames her child, and she runs out of the clinic that day, and she runs and she finds John Thomas. And John, she comes up, she says, Pastor Thomas, I have to tell you. Oh. And he says, that's amazing. Well, what happened? What did you name her? He says, I renamed her. Her name was once No Hope, but now I have renamed her. Her name is The Lord is My Hope. And as I think about that story, this is ultimately what God does. Is that when we are in seasons where there is no hope, we are reminded of the goodness and the presence of God that only he can offer. And in receiving it and in experiencing it, we move from a place where we have no hope to the Lord is my hope. If you'll remember at the beginning of the book, we have 2 needs. We have food and we have family. And as we get to the very end of this book, we can say food is checked, family is checked. Both the needs. But here's what is a super interesting thing I think that we overlook sometimes when we read this book is this. The name of God is not in this book a lot. We don't read a lot of like the Lord was doing this and the Lord was doing this. We see the hand of God all over the pages of this story. The Lord came and visited his people in Ruth chapter 1, verse 6. The Lord visited his people and allowed them to have food again, right? So the Lord brings food back, which means this, is that the need of food that was met, how is it provided? Because the Lord brought food. The very end in chapter 4, verse 13, when it tells us that Naomi and Ruth, where they have a son that essentially would carry on the family line, and that need of family that's met, it says that the Lord allowed Ruth to conceive a son. And as we get to the end of this book, it is this incredible reminder of us that the two main needs that we see of food and family are both met, but they are only met by God, which is the reminder for us today simply is this, is that Jesus alone is able to pay the price for your and my salvation and redemption. It is only by his goodness, it is only by his presence, and it is only by his working that we are able to stand up today and say, we have been redeemed by the blood of Jesus, only by the working of God in our life. So as we close this story and as we are reminded of the goodness that we see displayed in Boaz, I hope for you today is that it would be a small glimpse of overwhelming and the incredible blessing that God has done and the great sacrifice that he has done on our behalf to offer us as his people redemption. It's going to come out. We're going to sing two songs, and I just would hope this morning that as we sing that you would declare and respond to the goodness of God, the gospel of story, ultimately that it would lead us into a place of worship. We would say, God, thank you that you in the public square were elevated and mocked and spit at and all these things, but you did it for me. You did it so that I could be redeemed. Thank you that you invite me to sit at your table and to eat and to have my needs met and to find nourishment and to find fullness at your table. Thank you, God, that this ultimately is who you are. Father, we love you. We're grateful for your blessing. We're so grateful for your goodness. We're so thankful for the gospel that we have seen, Lord, just played out in this book. God, ultimately that you, Lord, as a loving Father, but as one who desires to redeem. And as we see this desire of Boaz to redeem, God, we see that picture way more, the eagerness way, way, way more in the presence of you. God, who sent your son, Jesus, to die for us so that your blood would purchase us from the depths and from the curse of sin, and it would bring us into the table. It would bring us into the fold and into the family of God. Thank you, Jesus, for the work you have done.